Well, we get to meet again.
Meet again.
Yeah. I thought we could start talking a little bit about brand, what it means to have a brand, to sustain a brand. It's very different now than the days of Tide and Crest and Oldsmobile.
Yeah, it sure is. So a few thoughts come to mind immediately. I think first and foremost, one thing that certainly we recognize and spend time on is the fact that while historically for companies that invested heavily in their company's brand and the umbrella brand for their product and services, that was focused more on the value of product added, why it was of lower price and new features. And what we have found over time is that that company brand is increasingly converging with the company's talent brand. And the talent brand was historically about why your company was the best place to work. And that was an opportunity to talk about mission and vision, your culture, your values. And the reason we see this convergence is, I think, in large part due to social media and due to this voracious appetite people have for information. Yes, there's information overload, but there's also an appetite for information. And so people increasingly are seeking out, when they're interested in purchasing a product from a company, what that company's all about. And so I think underlying both of these dimensions, the company brand / product brand and the talent brand, is authenticity. And I think it matters more than ever before. I don't think it's enough to just state your narrative and tell your story. I think it has to be something that is a deeply held belief by the leadership of a company and ultimately every employee of that company.
And in terms of the platforms people will do this on, the whole spectrum from social media up through print and television, or where?
Yeah, that continuum, is not going away anytime soon. It's not a question of all digital versus analog. You've seen for major events like the Super Bowl, this ability to bring huge numbers of people together at the same time, and I don't know that's going to change anytime soon, although it is interesting to note that Yahoo just announced a deal with the NFL to live stream a game from Europe. So it'll be interesting to see if that's some kind of an inflection point with regard to live events. So I think I think there's a need for both channels and forms of media, although I think this rise of digital is clearly an irreversible trend. I think the ways in which people are engaging with digital is only going to grow over time. I think you're going to see more and more experimentation with how folks are engaging with both channels simultaneously. People were calling that the second screen at one point, and that became kind of a buzzword, but I think we've just begun to scratch the surface there.
You've done a tremendous amount at LinkedIn to take advantage of the opportunities in mobile. Talk a bit about how that's changed the experience and your strategy. I find myself, I'm on your mobile site probably 50–60% of the time.
Just going to shut this off. Okay. So, with regard to mobile, we recognized several years ago the secular trend in terms of the rise of mobile and the ways in which people were consuming the web. And we projected out that at one point in the not-too-distant future, we were going to have what we referred to internally as our mobile moment, which was crossing the 50% threshold of how consumers of LinkedIn were engaging with the site. And in anticipation of that, we invested very heavily across multiple areas with regard to mobile. We had a cross-company initiative that we called Mobilize, aptly titled. And that started with a multi-app strategy and recognition that with regard to mobile devices, end users, consumers, customers were far more focused on singularly contextual experiences. They typically have less time, less real estate, and so on an app-by-app basis, they want a clearly defined value proposition. They want the company providing that value proposition to be able to deliver in a singular way. And so that really kind of crystallized the kinds of apps that we wanted to take to market. So we started with our flagship application, the LinkedIn flagship application, which was, to a large extent, trying to offer much of the functionality we have on the desktop. We also started rolling out, in quick succession, a number of our most important and most valuable applications, things like our flagship recruiter application, a job seeker application. We acquired a company called Pulse, which is a news reader. They're doing a nice job. We've got some great stuff in the pipeline there. So the multi-app strategy was a big part of what we wanted to do. We also, with regard to mobilizing at LinkedIn, we invested very heavily in training our team, because historically, and we weren't alone in this, a lot of companies were identifying kind of one tiger team internally that was responsible for mobile development in the early days. And that just doesn't scale. When half of your customer base is using you and consuming the site via mobile, you need to have mobile throughout your research and development efforts. And so we trained, for example, every software engineer at the company to be able to develop in mobile, our designers, et cetera. So that was the second core dimension of Mobilize. And the third was making sure we had the right infrastructure. And so there was a big investment in our API capability. And we invested in what's called, technically speaking, RESTly. And that enabled us to dramatically accelerate the rate with which we were able to not only develop for mobile, but to develop concurrently for desktop and mobile, and to port and extend our desktop experience into mobile.
Nice. So you're head of product as well as CEO. You're big picture and the details. Talk a bit about what you look for in product when you meet with people, what your basic principles are of a product that works.
Yeah, so took over the product role last October, and that's been a lot of fun. And you know, I've long been a product person with regard to the consumer web. It was one of the reasons I was hired into the CEO role. And Reid Hoffman and I both agree. Reid, the founder of LinkedIn, we both agree that it's very important for. You're going to start juggling? I thought he was going to give it to me, and I was going to be like this. We have chainsaws in the back. We can really bring the crowd to life. So when Reid was recruiting me, one of the things that we both had a deeply held conviction on, and I had learned it to some extent working at Yahoo for roughly 7 years, was that the consumer web companies that created the most value were largely led by people with strong product backgrounds. And so I was brought in large part for that perspective. And as CEO, I wanted to make sure that we were giving the product team enough space to do their thing, but I was certainly involved. So it was a very natural transition. And in the current role, you know, one of the things we changed was we added product reviews every day, 90 minutes of product reviews, literally every day. And it's some of the most fun we have on a daily basis. And at those product reviews, we're evaluating our products across 5 dimensions. And these are the 5 dimensions that we wanted to codify in terms of how we defined what a great product was. Because when I was in the role, I started talking about the fact that we almost had a singular objective, which was to build great products, and realized that could be like a Rorschach test. What's a great product for you may be different than what's a great product for me. And so wanted to codify that and then cascade that throughout the company. So we did that. So the first dimension of a great product, at least for LinkedIn's R&D efforts, is it delivers on a singular value proposition in a world-class way. So a classic example of that would be Google search. And you know, back in the late 90s, we all defined search as basically Alta Vista, and we thought it was done, even though looking back on it, keyword search was not the most effective way of doing it. Google got singularly focused on a new way of doing search based on PageRank, and the rest is history. And they were so focused on that singular experience that the first time people saw the Google homepage with just the search box and the brand and the logo, people were expecting the page to continue loading. So they had to add a little copyright at the bottom of the page so people knew the page had finished loading. That's how focused on search they were. And it doesn't have to be a juggernaut like Google. There's you know, many, many examples of companies that do a great job here. Some of which are startups. There's a meditation application a lot of people love now called Headspace. Anyone in the audience use Headspace? Anyone in the audience meditate? Maybe, okay, probably. Should have asked the second question first. So at any rate, Headspace does an amazing job of delivering on that value proposition. So startups, huge companies, delivering on singular value propositions in world-class ways, I think they're difference makers. I think two, once you're able to do that, you understand what kind of value you want to deliver. I think, two, is products need to be simple, intuitive, and ideally anticipate the needs of the people using those products. I'm a big fan of Waze. Waze is a mapping company. It was actually a driving directions company combined with maps, and it leveraged community intelligence. So drivers on the road would be able to indicate when there were traffic jams and things of that nature. And really, really clever app, and it adds a lot of value. And for as much value as I thought it was adding, delivering on that singular value proposition, I remember getting in my car one night, and I was on my way home from work, and before I had a chance to enter my address, it said, "Are you going home?" And I was like, well, yeah, I am going home. That's cool. So I clicked yes. And it anticipated my needs, and it wasn't rocket science how it did that, but it was an incredibly delightful experience I never forgot. You develop brand equity like that over time. Third is exceeding expectations. I think the best products exceed the expectations of the end user, regardless of where that bar has been set. And you know, there's multiple examples of this, but I remember the first time I flew Virgin America. Getting on the plane, any Virgin America fans in the audience? You remember the first time you got on the plane? You were like, what is this? Felt like a W hotel, like the trance music's going on in the background. So that made an indelible impression on me. I never forgot that. Fourth is that great products resonate emotionally. It's not just about utility. They make you feel something. And if you don't believe me, the next time you're having a conversation with someone and they're telling you about a product that they love, pay close attention to the way they're describing it and their body language and their energy, because people just get so jazzed up when they're talking about products that they love. There's tons of examples like this, but one of my favorite examples is Tesla. And you ask most people who drive a Tesla, and to some extent, they may not say the exact words, but they'll indicate it's like driving the future, even though Tesla has never marketed themselves as driving the future. It's just the way it makes you feel. It's like riding on a giant iPhone. And that brings me to the last one, which is great products change your lives for the better, in small ways, in large ways, great ways. And the iPhone is an amazing example of that. It's essentially the control panel for my life, and I think, you know, our phones have become the control panel for a lot of our lives. And interestingly enough, a lot of the examples I just cited of those other 4 dimensions, I access all of them. They all have apps on the iPhone. So we're looking at those 5 dimensions.
So if you've got those to mind, you have one of your 90-minute meetings. How close are people on all 5 dimensions, and is there one that you tend to spend the most time going, we can do better?
Yeah, so the one we tend to spend the most time on, anyone want to guess? No guesses from the audience? Emotional resonance, anyone else? Not very interactive. We got to get them going here. So it's number 1. So singular value. Now everyone's like, yeah, I knew that. I was just waiting for someone else to say it. Singular value proposition in a world-class way. None of the rest of the stuff matters. And as a matter of fact, things like emotional resonance, you can really start to focus in on that once you understand your target audience, once you understand what value proposition you're trying to deliver, and once you know you're delivering it. Then you can start to refine and iterate on simplicity and how intuitive the product is, the extent to which you're delighting and emotionally resonating, the extent to which you're exceeding expectations. And in aggregate, if you're doing all 4 of those things, you're going to change somebody's life in a positive way. So it's the first one, by far and away. When you start to deliver on the first one, and that's a very good sign, when a team is kind of checking the box on the first one, then you start moving forward, and that's when you get into really great discussions around, is this simple enough? Is it intuitive enough? What can we do to anticipate needs? How does this product make you feel? Those are the kinds of things we talk about.
So I'm fascinated by the question, is it simple enough? I always think there's so many products in the world that are over-engineered, that have too many features and not enough navigation. Is your job to get more features in, or to pare it back to the essentials?
So the beauty of the framework we were just talking about is the answer to that lies first and foremost with the first component, the first dimension. We'll add features or delete features based on whether or not we're delivering on the value proposition in a singular and focused way. To the extent you have too many things going on and you're diffusing that attention, it's going to be a suboptimal experience. So in that case, we want to pare back. To the extent we haven't done enough to deliver that value, you may start thinking about, should we be adding this feature and should we add that feature? But at the end of the day, you know, I'm a big fan of the Squint Test. Are you familiar with the Squint Test? Oh. So we didn't lose this one too. Oh, there we go. All right. There's a dog in attendance here today. What's the dog's name? Linus. You had to think about it for a second. Or you were going to give me his Twitter handle, or you were going to give the entire world his Twitter handle? I feel like all of a sudden we're doing stand-up, by the way, and I'm like heckling the audience.
Linus could have a lot more fans before this is done.
So yeah. So I'm going to go in a lot of different directions there. So what was the question? Squint test. Thank you very much. So the squint test is you look at a screen based on a consumer web experience, and you squint like this. Not that I need to tell you how to squint or anything. And you squint, and when you squint, certain things, the most prominent things on the screen are what becomes most noticeable. They're what pops. And if your singular value proposition or your most prominent call to action aren't the first thing you see on the screen when you're squinting, it fails the squint test. So that's the squint test.
I like it. Thanks.
What does Linus think, more importantly? No thumbs. He would have given the thumbs up? All right.
So I want to go back to our first meeting in 2012. And at that time, you were talking about the economic graph and sort of mapping everyone's jobs in the whole world. And it felt like a 20-year vision as opposed to a more medium-term strategy. You've moved fast on that. Fill me in on where the economic graph is and where you want to take it.
So I had the pleasure of being interviewed by George for Forbes, and he did a fantastic job with the article. It was one of the most comprehensive articles that had been written to date on what we were trying to accomplish. And towards the end of that, we got into vision. It may have even been, you know, what haven't I asked you that we should be talking about? Where are you taking the company 10 years out? And at the time, we were talking about our vision statement. So we have clearly delineated between our vision and our mission at LinkedIn. So our mission is to connect the world's professionals, make them more productive and successful. And a mission for us is an overarching objective that's measurable and achievable and ideally inspirational. So there's about 780 million knowledge workers in the world, which we use as a synonym for a professional. And that also includes students or pre-professionals. Our vision is our dream. It's true north for us, and it's designed to inspire. And our vision statement now for many, many years has been to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. And the global workforce is 3 billion plus people. So you can start to see the difference between the dream and the mission, the more measurable mission. And right around the time George and I sat down, you know, we were starting to see very good, healthy acceleration in the rate with which we were adding members. And we could see a path and a trajectory where we would have well north of 350, you know, 400 million members in the not too distant future. And sure enough, you know, we're at 364 today. So we're approaching the midway mark. And when we originally created the mission statement, it was early '09. And when I joined the company in December '08, we started thinking about this. There were 32 million members of LinkedIn. So we thought we had plenty of time to realize the mission, and the vision would just remain that true north. And so right around the time we were sitting down, we started saying to ourselves at LinkedIn, you know what, this mission statement, it's going to happen, and it may happen sooner than anyone could have anticipated. And what's a bigger dream that we should be dreaming right now? And then rather than leave that as true north, how do we begin to operationalize it? So literally a few months after you and I sat down, we do an annual planning kickoff with the leadership of the company, and we traditionally have a theme or set up some parameters, and that year it was manifesting our vision and operationalizing the economic graph. Mm-hmm. So for those that don't know, the economic graph for us is a digital mapping of the global economy. And when we talk about the global economy and what we can do in terms of digital representation, there's 6 dimensions. So the first dimension or pillar is that we'd like to see a profile for every member of the global workforce on LinkedIn, north of 3 billion people, all of them. The second dimension is we'd like to have a profile for every company in the world. And when you include small and medium-sized businesses, there's roughly 70 million companies in the world. We'd also like to have a digital representation for every job made available by those companies. Full-time, volunteer, for pay, temporary work, et cetera, all the jobs. We also want there to be a digital representation of every skill required to obtain the jobs offered by those companies. And in just a moment, we'll come back to a recent announcement we made in terms of the acquisition of Lengthens and what that meant for that pillar. We want there to be a digital representation or profile for every university or higher educational organization that offers the skills to get the jobs offered by those companies. And then lastly, we wanted to make it easy for any individual company or university to share their professionally relevant knowledge whenever they wanted to. And then we want to take a step back, and we wanted to allow all the nodes on this graph or map to connect in such a way that capital, all forms of capital, intellectual capital, working capital, human capital, would flow to where it could best be leveraged. And in doing so, our hope was that we could help lift and transform the global economy. So whereas several years ago that was true north, the vision, the dream, and kind of science fiction, today it's science. Because all 6 of those pillars, the building blocks, now exist. So the only thing preventing us from realizing this vision is scale, and that's going to be a question of time. And with regard to our newly announced acquisition of Lynda, on that skills dimension, prior to Lynda, the way we always spoke about skills was that we had access to data, standardized data, on tens of thousands of skills. So we knew what skills you have, and we knew what skills you would need to be able to realize certain opportunities. But we always felt like there was something missing in terms of going further and providing you the coursework or the knowledge you need to realize the skill. And so with the acquisition of Lynda, we now feel like that was the last major piece of the puzzle in terms of the building blocks for the economic graph. And across all 6 dimensions now, we've made a lot of progress. And while it's not going to happen tomorrow, I feel like sometime in the next 10 years, we'll be well down that path.
So I was just in India last month, and I was struck by how many of the people I was meeting with and their colleagues and their college classmates were all on LinkedIn. It's much deeper penetration than I would have expected. Talk a little bit about the breadth of LinkedIn's membership outside the U.S., and also traditionally there's been a bit of an imbalance. You've got a lot of members outside the U.S., but most of the revenue comes domestically. Is that where you'd expect to stay, or are there opportunities abroad that you'll start to monetize?
Yeah, so north of 70% of new members are coming from overseas. They're the majority of our cumulative membership. And from a revenue perspective, we're under-indexing. They're not surprisingly, given a number of our members are coming from developed economies. And there's enormous opportunity for us, putting monetization aside just for a moment, in terms of building into the mission statement of 780 million knowledge workers and then the 3 billion people in the global workforce. We're just getting started. And you look at a market like India, and it may come as a surprise to some folks, but India is our 2nd largest market in the world in terms of membership after the United States. So we're well north of 30 million members there, and we've had a strong presence there over a number of years now. And I think it makes more sense than ever. And I'm very grateful that we've made that investment starting several years ago, because you look at the work of Prime Minister Modi in India and the role that India is now playing on the global stage in terms of the 21st century global economy. And it is incredibly impressive to see the resurgence there and the entrepreneurial mindset that is growing increasingly pervasive. And they've always had the talent. They've certainly always had the resources and the numbers. But it's really interesting to see where he's taking that country right now. He's an influencer on LinkedIn. He's been very, very proactive. He just joined, roughly a year ago, and he's already on the verge of crossing 1 million followers. I think he's going to go well beyond that.
So is he going to knock off Richard Branson as the #1 influencer? Because these guys are competitive up there at that level.
I tell the team all the time, if you want to see people get really competitive, talk to CEOs, talk to heads of state about how many followers they have and who else has lots more followers. I don't think Richard Branson's, canonical influencer title is going to be threatened anytime soon. He's north of 8 million followers on LinkedIn. And, it's the perfect platform for him, given it actually ties back to what we talked about at the onset of the discussion. You were asking me about brand. Yeah. Richard Branson is the ultimate example of that convergence between the company brand and the talent brand. And his own personal brand has become inseparable from the Virgin brand. And he recognizes the power of authenticity in telling his story and bringing it all together as well as anyone. So I don't think it's surprising that he's at 8 million members. Beyond India, to your initial question about the opportunity, the international opportunity, China is a big opportunity. So if you go back to the immediate addressable 780 million professionals and students, China has 1 in 5 of that addressable. So north of 140 million professionals and students are in China. And that's a big number. And so we've been very fortunate in terms of our position in China. We have an extremely talented team there, and we now have a joint venture that's up and running. And we're local in China, so not only in language, but coming soon, we want to start to do some different things with regard to localizing the application itself. And we've made some good progress. There's still a long way to go, but over the first 10 years of the company's history, we generated roughly 4 million members in China. And since launching our local version in terms of local language simplified Chinese last February, that's more than doubled, so we're north of 9 million.
So as long as you brought up China, I know other social media companies have had a terrible time figuring out how to do business in China, and they've run afoul of the government or they get blocked. You figured out a way to do business in China. Talk a little bit about how you find an opening to be LinkedIn and yet work within whatever the constraints of China are.
I think that largely owes to our sense of purpose and what we're trying to accomplish. So as a platform that's trying to create economic opportunity, there is widely held belief in really every country that we can create value for the people within that country. And you look at what China's trying to accomplish right now, and one of their top priorities is a thriving middle class and the creation of economic opportunity. And so I think in that regard, what we're trying to accomplish is a strong fit.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about LinkedIn stock price. I have my list of stocks that I follow, and every time I look, you're at a different number than you were last time. The business objectives seem very steady and consistent, and the stock price flutters like nothing else. How do you live with Wall Street's moods?
You know, we said before we went public, I got asked the question by one of our board members while we were still a privately held company. And he said, what kind of public company do you want to be? And I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, what kind of public company is LinkedIn going to be? And I was like, I was speechless. So I said, let me give it some thought, and I'll come back to you at the next meeting. And I hadn't been the CEO of a public company before. I hadn't taken a company public before. So I didn't realize there would be a difference. And so I gave it a lot of thought. And we were, we talked earlier about codifying our mission, our vision. We also codified our culture, our values, our strategy. And we take that stuff very seriously. So after giving it some thought, I came back to the board and I said, we're going to be the same as a public company that we are as a private company. We're going to have the same long-term focus. We're going to have the same commitment to our culture and values. And if we're not able to do that, one of two things has happened. Either I wasn't the right person for the role, or we weren't ready to go public. And thankfully, we have remained true to what we're about, to that vision statement that you noted earlier. We're not only committed to it, we're operationalizing it, and the progress on the mission, and realizing our strategic objectives, and continuing to invest and uphold and manifest our culture and our values, which I think has emerged as one of our most important competitive advantages, our people and the way we do things. And so, fortunately, I think we're all committed to that. And with regard to the day-to-day fluctuations, as we've talked about before, internally and externally, Wall Street will determine the day-to-day stock price, and we're going to determine the long-term value of the company.
So you can live with it. Honest answer, how many times a day do you check the stock price?
There are some days I don't check it at all. And I get an alert from the New York Stock Exchange that sends out like an email before the market opens, and they talk about things to keep an eye on unrelated to LinkedIn. But I guess as part of that mailing list, they'll also send out how your stock did. And I guess they know we took the company public on the New York Stock Exchange. So, not a lot.
So you'd referenced 364 million members and sort of the tenfold growth that you've seen. Obviously, that's given you a lot more impact. It's given you a lot more resources. I know some companies, as they get really big, have trouble staying authentic, that their purpose, mission, objective starts to blur. What are the things you're doing to try and make sure that people know what LinkedIn stands for, no matter how big you get?
So a couple things came to mind immediately. Well, I guess three things. So first and foremost, you have to walk the walk and not just talk the talk on culture and values. There's a lot of companies where you'll go in there and they've got these beautiful murals with the culture and the values, or they'll distribute these laminated cards that everyone is expected to put on the back of their name tags or their badges or in their wallets. And that's all fine. I mean, we've got some rooms in LinkedIn that you can see our culture, values, and mission. But if you're not upholding that, if you're just talking the talk, it's not worth what it was printed on. And I think all of us have had an experience where we've been at a company and the senior leadership of the company gets up on stage and all hands and starts talking about the amazing culture and values of the company, and people in the audience are like, that all sounds great, but it's just not who we are, and it undermines the credibility of what that leader is trying to get across. So we take that stuff very seriously. We not only codified it many years ago and did that both tops down and bottoms up in terms of what kind of company we wanted to be, but we recruit against it, and we won't compromise. I think a lot of hypergrowth companies and startups, they first go off the rails as they're trying to keep up with demand. They have to put butts in seats. And so they know where their bar is set, but they compromise that for the sake of just trying to keep up. And that may work when you're 15 people all in one room, but when you're thousands of people in tens of cities around the world, you have to have the right people leading those offices, because you're not there to course correct in real time. And they're going to manifest whatever they're about, whatever culture and values they brought with them. So you need to make sure you're aligned in that regard. So you have to make sure your leadership is committed to it, not just the CEO, but the entire leadership team. And then together, you have to be committed to hiring against it, onboarding against that, developing on an ongoing basis your talent. And at LinkedIn, we even evaluate performance against the extent to which people are upholding our culture and values. So that's one. Two is there are certain tactics that I think companies and leadership can use and forums you can create to make sure everyone's on the same page. So one of the things that we always get tremendously positive feedback on at LinkedIn, culturally speaking, is we do an all hands every other week, and have certainly since I joined the company. People say, what? That's a lot of all hands, how do you do it?
But that's very much part of a startup culture, and a lot of companies let go of it as they get big and it moves to a quarter, and then the next thing you know, it's the annual meeting, and it's not a real meeting at all.
Yeah. And so consistent with this notion of remaining true to who we were and trying to uphold those things that made us special and unique as a privately held company, we still do the all hands every other week. As a matter of fact, you remember that story I mentioned earlier where the board member said, what kind of company do you want to be? And I said, we want to be the same. What I didn't tell you, I was trying to keep it short, but after that meeting, our CFO and general counsel came up to me. They were like, Jeff, psst, come here for a second. I was like, what? And they're like, you know how you said at the board meeting? These are good lieutenants. They didn't correct me inside the board meeting. They waited till afterwards. And they said, you know how you said at the board meeting nothing would change? I said, yeah. They said, well, you know that's not going to be the case. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, for example, one of our values is open, honest, and constructive. You want to be as transparent as possible, but how are you going to do that with the all hands once we're public? And I said, oh, we're going to do it. We're going to play up to who we aspire to be, and we're not going to play down to what we fear we might become, because that's self-fulfilling. So the all hands has been a big part of it. And then the last thing I would add, regardless of whether you're doing the all hands or not, repetition, repetition, repetition. And David Gergen, who is broadly accepted as an amazing communications expert, he served in 4 different White House administrations, both Republican and Democrat, in the field of communications, written a book on it. He has oftentimes talked about the importance of repetition, especially when someone is trying to get a point across to a broad audience. And a former colleague of mine once characterized that principle as needing to repeat yourself so often that you get sick of hearing yourself say it, and only then will people who are listening to that message begin to internalize it. Because the more you're saying it, you're like, people are going to get so sick and tired of me saying this, they're going to get bored. They have a lot going on, and so they need to hear it over and over before it begins to even settle in a little bit. And so I think it's hard to overstate the importance of repetition.
Terrific. We've overshot our timeline. The red light is blinking. The people are ready to come seize all of our microphones, even the third one that we've stashed away. So thanks so much for being part of our afternoon, and thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, George. Thanks, everyone.